that's who was under the threat of the Inquisition. So it was the Jews who said, all right, I'll just go through the motions and I'll formally convert to Catholicism. It's just sprinkling with water. It doesn't mean anything. And then years later, they or their descendants are burned at the stake because they're continuing to secretly practice Judaism. So a lot of the Jews said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave. So where did they go? They went to Portugal, which had the doors open. They said, hey, we'd love to have you. That was in 1492. Well, in 1497, the Portuguese monarch comes under pressure from the Catholic Church, and he says, look, this is kind of awkward. I've got hundreds of thousands of Jews. And he puts a different ultimatum. He says, convert or die.
Oh.
And in some instances, it's not even convert or die. He gathers the Jews into the public square in Lisbon, and he has these monks sprinkle water on them. And he says, now you're Christians. You've now entered into the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. If you go and don't work this Saturday, you're going to be burned at the stake. So it wasn't anything that even consciously said, oh, okay, I'll pretend to be Christian and really be Jewish. It was, they were literally sprinkled with water.
So he forcefully put them under the authority of the Catholic Church so they would have the authority to do this. Wow, right. So I didn't know that.
Spain was convert or leave, and Portugal was convert or die. And why'd they go to Portugal? Well, the languages are very similar from what I understand.
Yeah.
And they're also geographically right next to each other. Right? I don't even have to get in a boat. I can just walk to Portugal. So it was a good option for a lot of Jews. Now some left. And then you end up having Sephardic Jews living in Constantinople, right? What today is Istanbul. You have people, so you imagine this, you have people in what today is the west coast of Turkey who are speaking Ladino, which is sometimes described as a dialect of Spanish.
Yeah.
You could also argue that Spanish is a dialect of Ladino, right? They're both Romance languages. They're very similar languages.
Well,
right?
it's Hebrew and Spanish mixed together, right?
Right. Well, it was a dialect of Spanish spoken by the Jews, which included a lot of Hebrew words and Aramaic words, and then probably words from other languages that Jews had brought with them from other places, right? So, it was kind of this thing where at home they would speak Ladino, but when they went into the market and they were, buying something in the market or trading, then they would speak Spanish. And by the way, they weren't exactly speaking Spanish either, right? Each region of Spain had their own dialect.
Yeah.
Right. You had Castilian and you had Aragonese, and even today you have Catalonian, right, or Catalan, right. So today we'll talk about Italian and Spanish and French, but go back to any time before radio, and every 100 miles somebody had a different dialect that was barely intelligible to the other people. So certainly if you're not speaking in like a public format, right, you're speaking at home, you might be speaking your local dialect. I mean, it's still kind of that way in some places.
Well, I speak Spanish, and if I listen very closely while someone's speaking Portuguese, I can understand it. But I was listening.
What about if somebody's from Argentina? Can you understand them as well, or do you have to listen close?
Yes.
Okay.
Where the big difference is if someone's speaking Portuguese from Brazil. There's so much slang and I guess native words in the Brazilian form of Portuguese that I can't understand it for anything.
So this is an age-old question in linguistics. What is the definition of a dialect? And so for example, I'm told that people from Sweden can understand people from Finland, from Norway, and Norwegians can understand Swedes, but they speak two different languages. And they can both understand Danes, I guess. I don't know. So there's an old joke that was coined by a Jewish scholar who was like the great scholar of Yiddish. Because what's Yiddish? Yiddish is a dialect of German. And he says, right? Well, why is Yiddish a dialect of German? Why isn't German a dialect of Yiddish? And in reality, they both come from a common ancestor, which is Old High German or something like that. I don't know, I'm not an expert. But they both come from an earlier language, right? It's not that there was a Jew who immigrated to modern Germany and started speaking Yiddish, and that was his dialect of German. It was that you had Jews who were living in the Roman Empire in an area that was conquered by Germanic tribes, and they started speaking whatever that Germanic tribe spoke. And the Germans of today have a language that's descended from this Old High Germanic, and so is Yiddish, descended from Old High Germanic, right? And I guess there's Low German, whatever that is, right?
Yeah, so in other words, Ladino and Spanish, they both came from Latin, right?
They both came from an earlier language, which you can call Proto-Spanish or medieval Castilian. Or I don't know, I'm not an expert, right? But they both came from an earlier language. That's the point. So here it's different from, like, there might be a dialect of English spoken by Jews on the Lower East Side of New York 100 years ago, right? Well, those were immigrants who came to New York, and maybe they didn't speak fluent English. That's different than Ladino, which was, there were Jews who were living in the Roman Empire before it was, they were living in Spain and Iberia before it was the Roman Empire. They probably came there with Phoenician traders in the time of King Solomon and Hiram of Tyre, right? Because the Tyrians, the people from Tyre, had colonies and trading colonies in what today is Spain. And there were Jews who came along with them who were traders, right? So they were there before the Romans. Right, and they're speaking probably first Phoenician and then, well, Hebrew and then Phoenician and other languages, right, over time. And the language they're speaking when they're kicked out of Spain or forced to convert is a descendant of a series of different dialects and languages that evolved over time.